and his career is in flames. What did Jasmine say that made the system turn on its own architect? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At 9:02 a.m., the heavy doors to room 2141 creaked open. Jasmine Crockett entered alone, her footsteps sharp against the marble, echoing like a clock ticking toward collision. No cameras flashed, no whispers followed. She moved with the stillness of a storm-gathering force. In her hands, a thick, 300-page classified draft labeled Confidential Habeas Corpus Suspensions Protocol. Just the sight of it drained the room of breath. Across from her, Stephen Miller sat composed, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on her with cold calculation. His face barely moved, but the challenge in his stare said everything. No greetings, no gestures. Just silence, taut, loaded, and about to break. The chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Liberties, Representative Andrew Hollister, an independent with a war veteran's glare, cleared his throat and leaned toward the mic. This hearing, he announced, voice low but firm, will examine whether the fundamental rights of persons under U.S. jurisdiction, specifically habeas corpus, can be suspended in the name of immigration control. He paused, scanning the room. Let it be clear, we are not here to debate policy. We are here to decide if policy can trample the Constitution. The CSPAN cameras clicked on. Staffers froze mid-sentence. In the back rows, human rights observers from Amnesty International and the ACLU scribbled notes with white knuckles. At the center of the storm, Jasmine Crockett placed the thick document down on the witness table, opened to the first page, and raised her head. Her gaze cut across the chamber like a blade. Stephen Miller didn't blink. Neither did she. The war for America's moral soul had just begun, and the first shot had been silence. The silence held for a beat longer. Then the storm cracked open. Stephen Miller didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned into the mic with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed his defense in mirrors and closed rooms for years. This, he said, tapping the cover of the 300-page document with two fingers, is not an attack on liberty. It's the only way to stop the invasion at our borders. The word invasion rang louder than anything the mic could amplify. He let it hang, deliberate, like a charge waiting to ignite fear. His posture was pristine, shoulders back, spine straight, palms calm. But there was something in the way he measured his pauses, like every breath had been lawyered in advance. Every nation has the right to protect itself. America is no exception. The chamber stayed still, but the tension shifted. This wasn't a debate, it was a thesis, and Miller was delivering it like scripture carved from fear and framed in patriotism. If habeas corpus becomes a shield for illegal entry, then we've weaponized our own laws against ourselves, he continued, his eyes now briefly scanning the press section as if to ensure the soundbite would reach the evening news intact. What we propose is simple: expedited detention, limited judicial interference, and the prioritization of national sovereignty. If we don't act now, we risk collapse. Then he turned his full gaze back toward Jasmine Crockett, not with hostility, but with the practiced chill of a man who's convinced the law is only as moral as those who write it. This isn't cruelty, it's survival, he finished, hands folding neatly in front of him. For a moment it felt as though he believed he'd said something righteous. But across the table, Jasmine hadn't moved. Her hands stayed on the draft. Her face didn't shift. Yet something in the room had. A current beneath the surface. A silence no longer neutral. A reckoning about to speak. But whatever illusion of certainty Stephen Miller had built with his careful language shattered the moment Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift in her seat. But something in the room did. Something primal, something that recognized truth before it even reached the microphone. And what about human rights? She asked slowly, deliberately. Her eyes never left his. Or do you now decide who qualifies as fully human? It wasn't an outburst. It was an indictment, the kind that didn't need volume because it carried weight. A hush swept through the chamber, not out of respect, but in the way people go silent when they sense a line has been crossed and someone intends to drag it back. Jasmine lifted a small remote, pressed once. The room dimmed. A video filled the screen behind her. Time-stamped, official, damning. The footage opened with grainy black and white. A modest home in El Paso, Texas. A flash of movement. Federal agents at the door. Then, chaos. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, barefoot, handcuffed, and pulled into the night as his two children watched from behind their mother. No warrant shown, no charges read, just a single notation on the agent's tablet. Suspected MS-13 affiliation. Jasmine let the video play uninterrupted. The footage shifted to an ICE facility. Rows of cots, harsh fluorescent light, and a single shot of Kilmar sitting alone, unmoving, as an officer read from a clipboard with no translator present. Then the final frame. His daughter, only 8 years old, pressing both palms against the glass during a visitation. Her lips moved, silent. Her fingers trembled. On the other side, Kilmar mouthed something. Maybe I'm sorry, maybe I'll come home. But the moment broke something deeper than policy. It cracked the illusion of order. Jasmine turned back to the mic. Her voice didn't waver. He had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. She paused, the silence swallowing every cough, every breath in the chamber. His only offense was the color of his skin and where he was born. She didn't need to say more. In that moment, everyone in that room saw the truth. This wasn't about borders. It was about lines drawn by fear and who gets erased behind them. The image on the screen faded to black, but its ghost lingered. Kilmar's daughter, her small hands pressed against a pane of glass, still etched into every pair of eyes in that room. Some officials stared down, some blinked too often, others didn't move at all. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for a beat, letting the silence solidify, letting guilt settle into the hollow that truth had carved out. But she wasn't finished. Not with emotion, not with empathy, not with evidence. That had been the human cost. Now came the ideology that permitted it. And as she reached calmly into the binder at her side, the air inside room 2141 tightened again. This time with dread. This next part is harder to watch, she said, not theatrically, but with the flat, heavy tone of someone preparing the room for an autopsy. From her folder, she withdrew a slim set of pages, cleanly printed, dated, cross-referenced. These, she continued, raising the packet with one hand, are verified emails obtained in 2019. Emails in which Mr. Miller repeatedly shared material from websites known for promoting white nationalist ideology. The words didn't echo. They struck. A few heads turned sharply. Others didn't move at all. It was the kind of moment where no one knew whether to breathe or brace. She stepped to the side and rested the pages on the elevated committee table. Then she opened to a specific email, highlighted, dated October 2015, and read aloud with the calm clarity of a surgeon exposing rot. We need to focus on building a population that matches American DNA. Her voice didn't falter. She didn't add commentary. She let the words infect the air on their own. A ripple passed through the room. The chairman straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing. A court stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Reporters glanced at one another, mouths parted slightly. Not from surprise, but from the struggle of processing what had just been said in a congressional hearing under oath. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't satire. It was a sentence that had lived in a federal inbox and now echoed through the halls of American democracy like a confession. Jasmine looked up from the page, scanning the room deliberately. Stephen Miller, October 2015. She didn't look at Miller when she said it. She looked at the room. She looked at the system. She looked at every person who had sat quietly as one man's pen turned prejudice into policy. She placed the email face up on the table, fingers pressed flat, as if anchoring it to the world so no one could look away. And then she spoke. Not loudly, but slowly, purposefully, each word drawn from a well deeper than outrage. This isn't about protecting the border. It's about protecting a myth, one that says only certain people deserve to call this country home. A heavy breath exhaled somewhere behind her. On the far right side of the committee dais, a Republican congressman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand hovering between his notepad and the button to mute his mic. Two others quietly rose from their seats, eyes averted, and slipped out through the side door without a word. Their footsteps echoed like confessions. Jasmine didn't acknowledge them. Her focus remained forward. Miller, for his part, sat still, but his jaw had tightened. He didn't speak. For the first time that morning, he didn't even try to smile. The tension in the room was no longer just political. It was existential. What had begun as a legal hearing on habeas corpus had now cracked open something deeper, something rotten at the root. Jasmine had pulled back the curtain, not just on a man, but on a mindset. A quiet war waged in documents, decisions, and digital trails. And as the truth settled in, no one in the room could pretend it hadn't been there all along. They just stopped looking. She had forced them to see. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply stood by the evidence, hands steady, voice calm, and let the truth speak for itself. Because sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just shows you what was always there and dares you to keep denying it. The sting of Jasmine's final words still clung to the air like static. Only certain people deserve to call this country home. The room was motionless, caught between the weight of moral exposure and the discomfort of knowing it was true. Some shifted in their seats. Others sat frozen. But Stephen Miller, ever composed, never panicked. He straightened slowly, like a man who'd been waiting for this very moment, not to apologize, but to reassert control. His fingers curled once, then rested lightly on the edge of the microphone. When he spoke, it wasn't with fire, it was with ice. The Constitution makes allowances in times of national emergency, he began, his voice steady, almost soothing in its detachment. The phrase national emergency landed like a gavel, sharp, final, unyielding. Everything we've done, everything I've proposed, falls within the executive authority granted under such conditions. He paused, eyes scanning the chamber, not pleading, not persuading, but warning. His tone shifted subtly, becoming tighter, more deliberate. What's happening at our borders isn't routine. It's a crisis, an existential threat to the stability of our nation. His gaze lingered on the chairman just long enough to imply a shared responsibility, then moved toward the back where cameras blinked and pens raced. It was no longer a defense. It was a blueprint for authority unchecked. In emergencies, the government has the duty, not the option, the duty to act decisively. His hands pressed together, fingertips touching like a man reciting scripture. There was no remorse in his posture, no shadow of regret. This wasn't about damage control. This was doctrine. And if we hesitate because some find the methods uncomfortable, he said, his voice tightening into the kind of clipped edge only policy language can carry, then we fail in our most basic responsibility, to protect the American people. He didn't refute the email. He didn't mention Kilmar. He didn't even glance at Jasmine. It was calculated. He knew invoking legality would shift the room, turn morality into opinion, turn pain into procedural debate. In doing so, he redirected the fire, not to extinguish it, but to smother it in rules. But beneath that legal scaffolding, one truth remained unspoken yet visible in every unsmiling face in that room. Miller wasn't defending democracy. He was defending the machinery that could operate without soul, without scrutiny, so long as it called itself legal. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't just questioning the machine. She was threatening to unplug it. The room, already strained by Miller's invocation of emergency powers, now felt like it was holding its breath. His justification, precise, procedural, sterile, had been carefully laid out like a fortress built on the foundation of fear. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't aiming to shout over it. She intended to dismantle it, brick by brick, word by word, using the only weapon stronger than fear in a democracy, the Constitution itself. She leaned forward, her tone calm but unyielding, the cadence of someone who didn't need to dramatize the truth because it already carried more weight than any performance could. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, she said clearly, each word deliberate, each syllable like a drumbeat of accountability. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. She let that sit, not as opinion, but as law carved into the very bones of the nation. Then came the strike. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. Her delivery cut sharper for its restraint. And right now, you're manufacturing a fake crisis to justify a discriminatory agenda. No theatrics, no hyperbole, just precision. Crockett wasn't accusing Miller of overreach. She was accusing him of fabrication, a deliberate, cynical construction of crisis to serve an agenda rooted in exclusion. And this time, the argument wasn't emotional, it was constitutional. Across the room, Miller's practiced posture broke. The steeple of his fingers dropped to the table. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted, first to the committee chair, then to the press row, and finally, reluctantly, to the attorneys seated just behind him. One leaned forward, whispering quickly, quietly, urgently. Miller didn't nod. His jaw locked. A single muscle twitched at the base of his cheek, a minor betrayal of the control he'd fought to maintain all morning. The moment didn't explode. It cracked, quietly, deeply. What had been posed as legal strategy now stood exposed as constitutional fiction. Jasmine hadn't just countered his narrative. She had peeled it back and read aloud the line where it broke federal law. She wasn't grandstanding. She was excavating. And the silence that followed was filled not with noise, but with the weight of what had just been revealed. And in that silence, the room finally understood. Stephen Miller had built his argument on emergency, but Jasmine Crockett had just reminded the nation that emergency does not erase the Constitution. The silence that followed Jasmine's constitutional takedown was dense, tense with the weight of a truth that couldn't be unspoken. But she didn't stop. She didn't pause to revel or retreat. She turned the page, literally and figuratively, and moved to the part of the hearing few were prepared to confront, the racial architecture beneath the policy itself. If Miller's arguments had hidden behind legality, she was about to strip that cover away and put its moral logic on trial. She lifted another folder from the stack beside her. This one wasn't marked confidential, but its contents were no less explosive. "Let's talk about a policy implemented under your direction in early 2025, she said, unfolding a set of State Department documents under the soft hum of overhead lights. A targeted refugee program, quietly launched, quietly approved, offering fast-tracked entry and visa relief for Afrikaner families from South Africa, citing persecution based on race. A few in the room looked up, confused. Others looked down, uncomfortable. But Jasmine didn't waver. She spread the documents in front of her like a prosecutor laying out the final row of evidence. According to DHS records, over 7,400 white South African applicants, primarily Afrikaners, were granted entry under this specialized status within the first 6 months of the program. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, slower, more deliberate, like she was daring the facts to be challenged. Then she held up another page, high enough for the cameras to catch. A printed chart, marked in bold red. And during that exact same period, same time frame, same agency, same approval board, requests from Haitian and Syrian refugees dropped by more than 63%. She let the numbers speak for themselves, let the contrast bleed through, and then, with a quiet breath that carried the fire of 1,000 unheard voices, she drove the point home. "If this isn't a race-based policy," she said, locking eyes with Miller across the table, "then what exactly do you call it?" The room didn't erupt. It recoiled, a slow, collective pullback of posture, of denial, of comfort. This wasn't just about who got in. It was about who was designed to stay out. A handful of aides exchanged glances. One congressman on the far end folded his arms so tightly his knuckles whitened. Another pulled out his phone, pretending to check the time, but failing to hide the discomfort crawling up his spine. Miller opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. For once, the architecture of his rhetoric, so carefully built, so strategically deployed, offered him no exit. He looked at the table, then at the papers Jasmine had laid bare. The math didn't lie. The categories didn't lie. And Jasmine had drawn a line so sharp it didn't leave room for spin, only for answers. But she didn't demand one. She didn't press him. She just let the question hang in the air. 16 simple words that echoed louder than any policy briefing. If this isn't a race-based policy, then what exactly do you call it? The silence that followed wasn't like the others. It wasn't defensive or shocked or procedural. It was guilty. Not in the legal sense, but in the way people look at something they know is wrong and realize they were complicit in pretending otherwise. A moral silence, a silence of reckoning. Jasmine let it sit. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't look away. She wanted them all, every person in that room, every viewer watching at home, to feel the full weight of what selective compassion looks like when written in visa quotas and signed by the same hand that wrote speeches about border integrity. What she had done in that moment was not just expose a policy. She had peeled back the lie that immigration control was ever about security alone. She had shown the country that the gate had never been shut. It had been designed to open for some and lock for others. And the man sitting across from her had drawn that design in ink and defended it in plain sight. But now his silence said everything his words never could. The silence from her last line had not yet settled before Jasmine moved again. Not with outrage, not with rhetoric, but with something far more devastating. Memory. The legal arguments had been made, the charts had been displayed, the Constitution invoked. But now came the truth that no statute could erase. A truth that wasn't spoken in policy language, but in the language of grief. She reached into a slim, flat case beneath her documents, not quickly, not theatrically, but with the reverence of someone lifting something sacred. And from it, she pulled a small, faded teddy bear. It was charred on one ear. The seams were loose, one button eye missing, yet it radiated presence, instantly changing the temperature of the room. This was no prop. This was evidence of the kind no lawyer could redact. She held it in both hands, pressing it lightly to her chest, before placing it on the witness table in front of her. Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in weight. Her name was Mariana. She was 7 years old. Her mother carried her across the border near Eagle Pass in 2021. They were fleeing cartel violence, seeking asylum. Instead, they were placed in detention. The words came slowly, evenly, not to dramatize, but to give weight to a story no one had wanted to carry. She developed a fever, Jasmine continued, eyes locked on the bear, as if speaking both to the room and to the child no longer here. They asked for a doctor. None came. They begged for help. It never arrived. Her jaw tightened, but her tone did not waver. 48 hours later, Mariana died in a locked room with fluorescent lights and no windows. No one moved. The silence this time wasn't political, it was personal. Jasmine reached out and gently touched the edge of the bear's scorched fabric, brushing the burnt seam with her thumb. She wasn't just telling a story, she was presenting a wound. This is what her mother gave me, after the funeral, after the burial, after the system told her it was no one's fault. Then, and only then, did she lift her eyes and aim them squarely at Stephen Miller. Her voice was level, but there was steel behind every word. This is the last thing left from a child who died under a policy you designed. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She let the bear sit there in silence, its presence more damning than any headline. No camera crew could fully capture what was happening, because this wasn't just testimony, it was reckoning. The bear didn't cry, it didn't scream, but it spoke more loudly than any witness ever could. It said what the facts alone could not, that behind every executive order was a life, and sometimes the loss of one. The silence that followed Jasmine's final line was not the kind that fades. It was the kind that sinks, seeps, and stays. The scorched teddy bear remained on the table like a silent indictment, its presence undeniable, its meaning unspoken yet deafening. Most in the room sat frozen, gripped by a quiet that held the weight of something irreversible. But not Stephen Miller. He didn't retreat into that stillness. He struck against it, loud and visceral, as though noise might undo what truth had revealed. His voice sliced into the room like a sharp edge, desperate to reclaim authority. The carefully measured calm that had defined his earlier testimony was gone, replaced now by something raw, anger twisted in defense. "This is character assassination," he snapped, his jaw tight, the microphone catching the unsteady force beneath his words. His eyes narrowed on Jasmine, not with policy debate, but with personal accusation. Congresswoman Crockett isn't interested in law or security. She's here to inflame racial resentment. The words rang out like a signal flare, one not meant to illuminate but to provoke. His hands, once folded in precision, now hovered, agitated, barely restrained. She is weaponizing personal tragedy to stoke hatred toward white Americans. That's what this is. That's what it's always been. The line landed hard, not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. The oldest defense against accountability, to recast exposure as attack, to label truth as threat. He scanned the room looking for validation, for someone to nod or even shift in agreement. But the silence that met him was colder than before, less stunned, more disgusted. Still, he doubled down, voice hardening into disbelief, panic just beneath the surface. If anyone else spoke the way she just did, if they held up race as the sole measure of policy, this room would erupt. He jabbed a pointed finger toward Jasmine, not high enough to be called a threat, but just sharp enough to try and draw blood. But because it's aimed at people like me, it's considered righteous? Fair? And then the final fracture, his voice cracked, the tone of power giving way to one of desperate indignation. This isn't oversight. It's a political lynching dressed up as justice. The words dropped like lead. Even those seated behind him, legal staff, aides, conservative allies, shifted uncomfortably. Not because they didn't understand what he meant, but because in that moment it was clear he had no idea what he had become. Not a man defending a policy, but a man cornered by the truth of what that policy had cost. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't rise. She simply sat, still, steady, unshaken. Because sometimes the most powerful response is to let a man be destroyed by the sound of his own voice. Miller's outburst still lingered in the air, jagged and bitter, like smoke after a flash fire. His final words, "A political lynching dressed up as justice," were meant to provoke, to destabilize, to force Jasmine into anger. But they failed. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise. And most telling of all, she didn't lower herself. Instead, she moved with quiet control, the kind that comes from surviving storms far worse than this. Her fingers, steady and sure, lifted a single page from the stack before her. No showmanship, no need for drama. Truth was more than enough. "Hatred," she said, her voice firm but low, "is what you planted. I'm just here cleaning up the wreckage." The room didn't react with gasps or outrage. It froze. Because the line didn't need to be shouted to be heard. It was felt. It was lived. Jasmine held the page up briefly before laying it down again, turning it just slightly toward the committee chairman and the cameras behind him. "This document is from an internal audit by the Department of Homeland Security," she stated, enunciating each word with the clarity of someone who knew the burden of being doubted. "It wasn't leaked. It wasn't partisan. It's official, time-stamped and reviewed by oversight staff within DHUs just 6 months ago." She tapped her index finger on the bottom of the page. A soft sound, but it struck like a gavel. "It shows that 73% of individuals denied their right to appeal under your expedited removal framework were either Black or Latino." Her gaze swept the room, not pleading, not theatrical, but confrontational in the most exacting sense. Not because they posed a threat, not because they failed to qualify, but because of who they were, what they looked like, where they came from. No one interrupted, not even Miller. He sat still, hands clasped tightly together now, as if gripping onto the last remaining threads of plausible deniability. The legal team behind him exchanged glances, no longer whispering strategies, but watching as the ground beneath them eroded, inch by inch. Jasmine didn't press the moment further. She didn't need to. The data had spoken. The disparity was real. The silence it summoned was not one of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition, of complicity, of a system finally being shown a mirror it couldn't turn away from. And Jasmine, she simply leaned back, her eyes unwavering. Because in that moment, she hadn't just dismantled a policy, she had exposed a pattern, a truth, a structure of discrimination buried beneath the language of national security. And now that it had been named, it couldn't be unseen. The evidence was undeniable. The room had fallen into a heavy, breathless quiet, not because Jasmine Crockett had shouted, but because she hadn't needed to. Her words, her documents, and that single scorched teddy bear had done what years of political theater had failed to do: make injustice feel real. But the story didn't stop inside room 2141. In fact, it had just begun to explode beyond it. Because while the chamber sat still, the internet ignited. Across the nation, and then the globe, the live stream surged. What began as a standard congressional oversight hearing had gone viral in real time, catching fire within minutes of Jasmine's confrontation with Stephen Miller. Viewership hit 1 million, then 2, then 5. By the time she held up the internal DHS report and laid bare the racial imbalance in Miller's policy, over 18 million people were watching. In just under 2 hours, her words were being translated, subtitled, clipped, and shared across every platform imaginable, from TikTok to Twitter, from Instagram to cable news banners. But it wasn't the charts or even the moment Miller lost control that captivated the world. It was one sentence, a single line, delivered with quiet fury, now etched into history. America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't written by staff. It was raw, unscripted, and undeniable. That one sentence became the spark. Within minutes, it was a TikTok audio trend. Within an hour, it was on protest signs in front of federal buildings in 7 different states. The hashtags came fast and hit hard. Crockett versus hate trended #1 on Twitter. Miller files hit 2.3 million posts in under 5 hours. Memes were created, yes, but so were movements. Teachers played her speech in classrooms. Activists stitched her words into denim jackets. And somewhere between viral and historic, the moment became something else entirely, irreversible. Then came the crack that no one expected, but everyone had been waiting for. A former DHS official, someone who had worked directly under the expedited removal program Miller once championed, released a video. It wasn't flashy. It was shot in a parked car with low lighting and a shaking voice. The man, who had never spoken publicly before, looked directly into the camera and said, "We were ordered to bypass process, told to reject appeals, even when we knew they had merit. We were told to flag names by origin, not evidence. We knew it was wrong. We did it anyway. We were scared. But today, after what I saw in that room, I can't stay silent. We were forced to break the law." The clip shattered the digital sphere. It was picked up by every major outlet. The Department of Homeland Security issued a formal statement within hours, saying they would review all operational guidance issued during the 2025 re-implementation of border protocols. But the damage had already pierced the membrane of plausible deniability. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about command, about deliberate strategy, about what had been built and who had been hurt in silence. As the hours passed, Jasmine Crockett's name trended not just in political circles, but in homes, in classrooms, in boardrooms. Artists painted murals of her holding the burned bear. Civil rights groups demanded congressional follow-up. Immigration lawyers began compiling evidence for federal class action suits. And through it all, one image kept circulating: a still frame of Jasmine, seated in the chamber, holding the bear to her chest, eyes locked on Miller, moments before she said, "This is the last thing left from a child who died under a policy you designed." That image, paired with her DNA filter quote, was now framed in thousands of posts, headlines, and digital billboards. No one could pretend they hadn't seen it. And those who once tried to keep the conversation buried behind bureaucratic shields now found themselves exposed. The illusion of technocratic neutrality had been broken, and in its place stood something far more powerful: a reckoning that could be named, traced, and now proven. The response wasn't universal praise. Critics attacked. Networks scrambled to reframe. But even they couldn't stop the tidal wave of clarity that had just swept across a divided country. In a political world built on spectacle, what had struck deepest that day wasn't performance. It was truth, unflinching, documented, and most importantly, seen. And as millions watched Jasmine Crockett walk out of that hearing room, With nothing in her hands but a stack of truth and a burned teddy bear, the message had already reached further than any legislation ever could. No more hiding behind policy. No more silence in the name of order. The system had spoken, and this time, someone had finally spoken back. The hearing room had become a battlefield where truth had finally drawn blood. Jasmine Crockett's words, the evidence, the scorched bear, all of it had pushed the line beyond rhetoric and into something irreversible. Millions had watched it unfold in real time, but inside room 2141, where the air still hung thick with the weight of exposed injustice, a decision now loomed, one that would not simply conclude a hearing, but potentially ignite a national reckoning. And it would begin with a single question: would Congress act, or would it once again flinch in the face of its own reflection? Chairman Andrew Hollister, a war-hardened independent known for his blunt manner and unwillingness to be swayed by party lines, adjusted his glasses and spoke into the mic. His voice was measured, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. This committee has heard sworn testimony, reviewed classified documentation, and received public declarations from career federal officials. The allegations presented are not policy disagreements. They are potential violations of federal law and basic human rights. He paused, scanning the semicircle of lawmakers, his eyes lingering on each of them. Not as colleagues, but as jurors. Therefore, pursuant to our oversight authority, I am calling for a motion to vote. Shall this committee formally refer all findings and evidence from today's proceedings to the Department of Justice for a full federal investigation into Mr. Stephen Miller's role in the alleged systemic denial of due process and violations of civil and human rights under United States law? You could feel the air shift, the kind of pressure that comes when the room realizes history is about to etch itself in ink. Staffers stiffened. Reporters leaned in. Miller, still seated, no longer wore the same air of defiance. His jaw was clenched, hands white-knuckled as he gripped the arms of his chair. He wasn't in control anymore. He was waiting, watching, cornered by the very mechanisms of the system he once weaponized. The vote began. Each member's name was called, and each answered into the mic with clarity and weight. Yes, yes, a pause. No, then yes, another yes, then another. The count moved forward like a slow, rising drumbeat, steady, unstoppable, final. One of the committee's most conservative members looked visibly torn, tapping their pen against the desk, eyes darting toward Miller, then toward the public gallery where a DHS whistleblower sat with folded arms. After a breathless moment, she spoke. Yes. By the time the final vote was cast, you could hear the exhale ripple across the room like a tide breaking against the walls of denial. Hollister nodded, gave no theatrical flourish, and announced what everyone now knew was coming. By a vote of 10-3, this committee moves to refer all relevant documents, sworn testimony, and digital evidence to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. No cheers, no applause, just stunned silence, followed by the rustle of papers and the furious typing of journalists. One aide stood and quietly delivered the sealed recommendation folder to the clerk, who walked it out of the room like it contained the future itself. Because maybe it did. Stephen Miller didn't speak, didn't blink. His face, drained of color, now wore the look not of someone who had lost a debate, but of someone who had been named. Not a political operative, not a strategist, but a potential defendant. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply gathered her papers, pressed her hand once more to the bear resting beside them, and stood. Her final glance at the committee table was not one of victory, but of responsibility. Because this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. And now the machinery of accountability had been set into motion. Slow, heavy, and, for once, pointed in the right direction. The gavel had barely struck its final note when the undercurrent in room 2141 began to shift. No longer humming with legal argument, but reverberating with something deeper, more primal. It wasn't victory, it wasn't resolution, it was fallout. Jasmine Crockett had exited the chamber like a woman who had delivered both truth and burden, leaving behind not just scorched paper trails and shattered denials, but a silence no official statement could cover. The bear was gone. The charts were closed. But what remained was the weight of everything that had been seen, heard, and no longer deniable. And at the center of that wreckage stood one man, pale, silent, undone. Stephen Miller hadn't moved since the vote. For minutes that felt like hours, he sat in his chair as if it might protect him from the reality crashing down on the other side of the table. His fingers rested on his lap, clenched tightly, not in defiance but in something far more fragile, disbelief. The once composed architect of border walls and wartime rhetoric now looked like a figure from a crumbling painting. Details washed out by exposure. The cameras still rolled. Every angle captured the disintegration, not of policy, but of posture. The man who had designed so many walls was, in this moment, defenseless. When he finally stood, it wasn't with the confidence of a public servant. It was with the heaviness of a man carrying the weight of knowing that his name would no longer be written in footnotes, but in federal investigations. His legs were stiff, his shoulders, usually squared in self-importance, slumped forward. The skin around his mouth had lost all color, lips pressed into a narrow, bloodless line. He reached for his folder, only to stop halfway, as if realizing there was nothing inside that could help him now. With a trembling hand, he tucked the papers under his arm and turned toward the exit. But there was no quiet escape waiting for him. The doors opened, and with them came the blinding white storm of flash photography and broadcast chaos. Outside the chamber, the corridor had transformed into a gauntlet of accountability. Reporters surged forward like a wave held back for too long. Boom mics and camera rigs swung into position. Every lens was trained on him, not as a public figure, but as a man suddenly and irreversibly under the weight of consequence. Mr. Miller, do you deny the internal DHS findings? Why were appeals denied to 73% of Black and Latino asylum seekers? Did you authorize fast-track deportations against legal counsel advice? Do you accept responsibility for Mariana's death? Will you resign before the DOJ investigation begins? The questions came rapid fire, each one sharper than the last, but Miller didn't answer. He didn't even raise his eyes. There was no rebuttal, no indignation, just silence. A silence now louder than anything he could have said. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched beneath his cheekbone. His breasts were short, barely visible. He walked like a man shrinking from his own legacy, not escaping it. Each step echoed off the marble floor, chased by camera shutters and unanswered demands. He passed by a digital screen in the hallway where the live stream replayed on loop. Jasmine Crockett's voice rang through the static. Hatred is what you planted. I'm just here cleaning up the wreckage. He kept walking. But those watching didn't miss the way his eyes flickered toward the screen, or the way his pace faltered ever so slightly, as if her words, repeated now by millions, had finally pierced the layers of armor built over years of power and immunity. No one walked beside him. The aides who had once orbited him like loyal satellites now lingered at a distance, waiting to see what gravity might claim him. One reached forward hesitantly with a tablet, perhaps offering notes or a prepared statement, but Miller waved it away with a weak shake of the head. Not today. Not after what had just been said, proven, and broadcast to every corner of the nation. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered, not chanting, not yelling, just watching. Phones were raised. Some had signs, simple, devastating words like, due process is not optional, Mariana deserved better, and policy is not immunity. As Miller descended the steps, his foot caught slightly on the edge of the last one, forcing him to pause for the briefest of moments before regaining his footing. To some, it was nothing, but to others, it was everything. A glimpse of the man behind the policies, stripped of myth, of spin, of protection. A black SUV waited at the curb, its back door opened by a driver who didn't say a word. Miller ducked inside, head still low, hands visibly shaking now as he fumbled with the seatbelt. Cameras caught every frame as the door shut with a dull thud. Within seconds, the vehicle pulled away, but not fast enough to escape the message that now hung over the Capitol like a storm cloud waiting to break. The video of his silent walk trended within minutes. The hashtags Miller collapse, Crockett truth, Injustice begins now surged across every major platform. Some edited his exit alongside Jasmine's final lines. Others overlaid it with the haunting image of Mariana's burned bear. But all told the same story. This was no longer just a hearing. It was the beginning of accountability. Stephen Miller had once been the man behind the curtain, unseen, unchallenged, untouchable. But now he had walked through the storm he created. And for the first time, the world saw not power, not brilliance, not strategy, but consequence. He left no final quote, no spin, no fire. Only the sound of the truth catching up to him, and the echo of a door closing behind him that sounded far too much like history turning the page. The SUV carrying Stephen Miller had long disappeared into the gray arteries of Washington, but its exit didn't signal the end. If anything, it was the closing of one chapter, the one written in secrets, loopholes, and silence. Inside the Capitol, the air was heavier now, not with tension, but with the undeniable weight of truth that had just been unearthed, broadcast, and etched into the public memory. Jasmine Crockett hadn't planned to speak again. She hadn't prepared a statement, hadn't coordinated with media teams or speechwriters, but truth has a rhythm of its own, and it doesn't wait for press conferences. And so, as the hearing room emptied and the world leaned forward, she walked straight into the rotunda where the press had already gathered, the nation holding its breath. She stood at the edge of the podium alone. No entourage, no aides at her side. The light above her cast a quiet glow against the granite floor. In her right hand, the black folder containing evidence, testimony, and federal admissions. In her left, the bear, burned, battered, but still intact. The very object that had turned a cold policy hearing into a moral reckoning. Reporters surged forward, drawn not by the anticipation of a political statement, but by something rarer. A woman who had just shifted the national narrative, standing before them without the shield of spin. She looked across the room and waited not for silence, but for stillness, waited for the cameras to stop blinking, the shuffling to cease, the questions to retreat into their microphones. And when that moment came, a breathless quiet with millions watching from every screen in America, Jasmine Crockett spoke. Power, she said, her voice calm, resonant, and cutting, was never meant to suppress. It was meant to protect. The words didn't thunder. They bled into the room like truth finally finding oxygen. Every syllable fell with purpose, and every face turned just a little more toward her, not because they were told to listen, but because they couldn't not. She didn't blink, didn't shift. She had said the line before, in smaller rooms to quieter crowds. But today, with the full weight of the system around her, it hit like a bell tolling deep inside the soul of the nation. Her eyes swept across the chamber, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. We've seen what happens when power forgets its purpose, and she continued, her voice unwavering. We've seen it in the cages, in the denials, in the stamped papers with no explanation, but country of origin. We've seen it in the children who never made it out of holding cells, in families separated with no plan to reunite, in courts that never opened, in hearings that never happened. She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let everyone else find theirs. Then slowly, she lifted the bear, soft, scorched, silent, and held it up just high enough for every camera, every spectator, every American to see. This is not policy, she said. This is not partisanship. This is what's left when compassion is replaced by calculation. Her thumb brushed along the stitched ear. Her name was Mariana. She was 7 years old, and she is gone. Not because of an accident, not because of a misunderstanding, but because somewhere along the way, someone decided her life wasn't worth the same due process as anyone else's. Some in the crowd wiped tears. Others simply stared, transfixed. The bear was no longer a prop. It was a mirror, and every person watching could now see themselves reflected in the system that had failed a child. Jasmine's tone sharpened, not louder, but more precise. When you choose who gets to live, she said, locking eyes with the press corps, you stop being a public servant and become a judge of worth. But here, Life does not wait for permission. The silence that followed didn't last long. It started with a single person in the gallery, an older woman in a gray coat, who stood up and began to clap. Then another, and another. Then the press. Then lawmakers who had been watching from behind pillars and cameras. One by one, people stood, not in politeness, but in understanding. The room filled not with noise, but with an energy that hadn't been felt in that rotunda in years. It wasn't applause for a politician. It was recognition of something far more rare, moral clarity in a place built to avoid it. The ovation thundered. Across the nation, phones buzzed with notifications. The clip of Jasmine's closing words was already flooding every social feed. Editors scrambled to revise their headlines. TV anchors went off script. Hashtags surged again. #, right to live. #, Crockett speaks. #, power to protect. Advocacy groups began organizing candlelight vigils, not for political protest, but for remembrance. For Mariana, for Kilmar, for the families never shown on screen. But Jasmine didn't raise her hand in triumph. She didn't wave or take a bow. She simply stepped back from the podium and laid the bear down gently, right in the center of it. An offering, a memory, and a warning. The camera zoomed in, and in that single frame, no flags, no slogans, no banners, was all the proof America needed. Justice had finally been spoken aloud. As she turned to leave, a reporter called out, "Congresswoman, what now?" Jasmine stopped mid-stride. She didn't turn around. She just spoke. Quiet, grounded, final. "Now, we make sure it never happens again." And with that, she walked down the marble corridor, her steps echoing into the history she had just rewritten. 3 days had passed, but the country hadn't taken its eyes off room 2141. The scorched teddy bear, the standing ovation, the silence of Stephen Miller as he vanished into a black SUV without a word. It all lingered, not just in headlines, but in living rooms, classrooms, Senate briefings, and whispered conversations in places that rarely spoke of justice. Jasmine Crockett had ignited something larger than a hearing. She had exposed not just one man, but an entire system's quiet collusion. And America had done what it rarely does so quickly. It listened. It watched. It demanded a response. And that response came, quietly, but with the full weight of law behind it, on the morning of the third day. At 7:43 a.m., the Department of Justice issued a formal press release. No leaks, no preamble. Just 12 devastating words in bold typeface. A federal investigation into Stephen Miller has been formally opened. The rest of the statement read like a verdict already underway. The Office of Civil Rights and the Public Integrity Section would jointly oversee the probe. The investigation would examine Miller's potential abuse of executive authority, his alleged orchestration of discriminatory policy targeting asylum seekers by race and nationality, and credible reports of systemic due process violations under his advisement. It confirmed that whistleblower testimony, classified DHS communications, and congressional evidence, including the DHS internal report introduced by Representative Jasmine Crockett, had been submitted as primary exhibits. Within minutes, the country ignited again. Every major network cut into regular programming. Cable news anchors leaned forward, brows raised, voices hushed in a way reserved only for moments that shift history. The press, who only days earlier had chased Miller through Capitol corridors, now lined up outside the DOJ's Civil Rights Division in D.C., broadcasting live under banners reading, "Miller under federal investigation." Even international outlets picked up the feed. Germany's Der Spiegel called it a reckoning for America's conscience. Al Jazeera led with, "Policy now on trial." But at the center of it all was one unmistakable thread. Someone had finally broken the wall of immunity. Inside the DOJ headquarters, lights didn't flicker on with ceremony. They snapped awake in rows of cubicles, case files, and exhausted but resolute civil rights attorneys who understood the gravity of what had just landed on their desks. For years, they had read the headlines, seen the numbers, watched the footage, but never been empowered to act. Now they weren't being asked to investigate, they were being unleashed. In one office, a team reviewed internal DHS emails sent between Miller's policy office and regional ICE directors. Words like expedite, minimize appeal, And Flag Origin First began showing patterns. One analyst stared at the metadata and whispered, "This wasn't negligence. It was structure." In another room, the whistleblower who had released the car confession video was scheduled for a full sworn deposition under federal protection. He arrived with a flash drive, 32 folders, all time-stamped, all archived. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "I should have done this years ago," he said. "I was just waiting for someone to make it safe." And someone had. On Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the same marble dome where she had laid down the bear. She didn't speak to the cameras that day. She didn't need to. The Justice Department had spoken for her. But as reporters swarmed her staff for statements, one aide offered a single line, one that echoed through every press room like prophecy. "Truth doesn't just shine, it burns." That same afternoon, outside a courthouse in El Paso, dozens gathered with signs bearing Mariana's name. A local pastor read Jasmine's quote aloud through a bullhorn. "When you choose who gets to live, you stop being a servant and become a judge of worth." The crowd, silent, bowed their heads. Not in defeat, but in defiance of forgetting. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Stephen Miller's legal team released a one-paragraph statement. Mr. Miller categorically denies all allegations. He will cooperate fully to correct the narrative and defend the integrity of his public service. But the cameras caught him entering a private office building hours later, head down, lips pursed, flanked by two lawyers in navy suits. There were no chants, no insults, just the quiet rhythm of justice catching up. 3 steps behind, now only 1 step away. By nightfall, the DOJ building was lit from within. Inside, a war room had been established. Whiteboards tracked timelines, personnel, dates of key policy rollouts. In one corner sat a folder marked Miller Directive 4A, Targeted Removal Acceleration, March 2025. It was signed, stamped, documented. Its language, clinical, coded, spoke of priority indexing by threat profile, a term now understood to mean race. The attorneys worked late, not because of pressure, but because of clarity. They knew what this was. This was not just an investigation into one man. This was a nation finally asking itself, what did we allow? What did we ignore? What now must be undone? And as the midnight hour approached, one of the lead prosecutors closed her laptop, stared at the bear resting quietly on her desk, sent earlier that day by Jasmine Crockett's office, and said to no one in particular, "We owe it to her to finish this." The lights stayed on, the wheels turned, the reckoning at last was in motion. But even as the Justice Department pressed forward, even as hearings gave way to subpoenas and headlines turned to indictments, there was one truth that pulsed beneath the political and legal machinery now in motion. This was never just about Stephen Miller. It wasn't only about one hearing, or one child, or even one vote. It was about a deeper rot, one that had been allowed to settle in the bones of the system for years, unseen because it wore a tie, unchecked because it signed memos instead of swinging batons. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed it. She had named it, dragged it into the light, and demanded the world reckon with what it saw. But the story's final weight didn't rest on Miller's fate. It rested on what came next, on what we, as a people, were willing to learn from everything that had been torn open. The human lesson was never hidden. It had been there from the moment Jasmine placed a scorched teddy bear on the witness table and asked a nation to remember that justice isn't sterile and policy isn't neutral. The system had told Mariana's mother that her daughter's death was nobody's fault. But Jasmine made it clear, when a system denies care, denies process, denies empathy, it is no longer a system. It is a machine, and machines do not grieve. That was the first lesson, that humanity, when stripped from policy, creates not order but devastation. That in the cold language of security, it is always the innocent who bleed first and longest. The second lesson was harder, more personal, more dangerous. It was this: silence is complicity. Every official who looked the other way, every department that signed off without asking, every leader who spoke in vague platitudes while children disappeared behind barbed wire and bureaucracy. They weren't neutral. They were participants. The machine only worked because good people let it. Jasmine didn't just face Stephen Miller that day. She faced a century of institutional cowardice. And in doing so, she reminded us that neutrality in the face of injustice is not a shield. It is an endorsement. That's why her voice cracked the chamber. Not because it was loud, but because it refused to be quiet anymore. And then came the third lesson, perhaps the most painful of all, that democracy only works if we make it human again. The Constitution is not self-enforcing. Rights do not defend themselves. And power, if not constantly reminded of its purpose, will always tilt toward preservation, not justice. Jasmine didn't walk into that room with just legal knowledge. She walked in with a conscience sharpened by experience, with empathy carved by loss, with anger refined into discipline. She showed us what happens when one person, armed with truth and nothing else, chooses to speak anyway. In a world drowning in noise, her clarity cut through like a blade. She didn't shout to be heard. She whispered and dared the silence to answer. What makes her story unforgettable is not the viral moment, not the vote, not the headlines. It's that she didn't need to win to change everything. She just needed to show up, to speak, to stay. She reminded a weary country that truth can still outlast power and that moral clarity, though rare, is more contagious than fear. The lesson wasn't just legal or political, it was human. That when power forgets its purpose, someone must remind it. And when policy becomes cruelty, someone must name it. And when justice hesitates, someone must walk into the fire and say, "Not today." So what do we do with a lesson like that? We remember Mariana, we remember Kilmar, we remember every silent name that didn't trend, every child without a camera, every parent who begged and was denied. We hold their stories like fire in our hands and refuse to let them go cold. We stop pretending that injustice is someone else's fight and start recognizing that silence too has fingerprints. And most of all, we remember Jasmine Crockett. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to stand, willing to speak, willing to risk being the only voice in a room built to drown her out. That is the human lesson. Justice does not begin in law. It begins in conscience. And if we dare to follow that voice, if we dare to become it, then maybe, just maybe, we can stop asking who gets to live and start becoming a country that no longer needs to. And if the lesson left behind by Jasmine Crockett still burns in your chest, if Mariana's scorched bear and Stephen Miller's silent exit still echo in your mind, then the time for watching is over. This story is not meant to be remembered. It is meant to be answered. Because injustice never vanishes on its own. It survives in the silence between moments like this and the action that must follow. So the question is no longer what did we witness? It is what will we do now? We must demand that our representatives push for full accountability, not just for Stephen Miller, but for every official who signed cruelty into law under the veil of procedure. We must vote, not just with ballots, but with presence, with protest, with relentless pressure to protect the powerless. We must write, speak, and organize like our democracy depends on it, because it does. We must build a system where no child's life is ever measured against a border map or a racial algorithm. We must rise not when the fire is raging, but when the ashes are still warm, because that's when change begins. And above all, we must never forget that the most dangerous policy is the one we pretend doesn't exist. Speak, act, push forward. Justice doesn't wait, and neither can we. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. When Jasmine Crockett confronted Justice Neil Gorsuch over a $500,000 land deal right in the middle of a live congressional hearing, in just 7 explosive minutes, she unveiled buried evidence, forced Gorsuch to recuse himself, and triggered the first criminal investigation in history against a sitting Supreme Court justice. Washington fell silent. Congress held its breath. America erupted. In a city built to protect silence, only one woman dared to speak and shook the very pillars of American justice. What did Jasmine say that brought a Supreme Court justice to his knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was just after 9 a.m. when the nation held its breath. Inside the marble halls of the U.S. Capitol, camera flashes cracked like gunfire as room 2141 prepared for history. This wasn't a routine oversight, it was a reckoning, a live public hearing on the ethical conduct of the United States Supreme Court, broadcast into millions of homes. Every microphone was hot, every lens locked in, and at the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a fierce voice from Texas, now squaring off against the most insulated bench in America. Some had questioned her role, too young, too bold, too progressive. But the moment she stepped into that chamber, draped in courtroom black, eyes sharp behind polished frames, those doubts vanished. She wasn't posturing, she was precision. Today, Jasmine wasn't just challenging power, she was confronting the very system that shields it. Because seated across from her was Justice Neil M. Gorsuch, the first sitting Supreme Court justice ever forced to testify under oath for a private financial deal shrouded in silence. Gorsuch entered the room like a man above consequence. He wore his privilege like armor, stoic, untouchable, flanked not by clerks or colleagues, but by a seasoned Georgetown attorney. He offered no nod to the chair, no glance at the dais. He simply sat, arms folded, jaw firm, his entire posture radiating contempt. To the millions watching, it was unmistakable. He wasn't just denying wrongdoing, he was denying the legitimacy of the hearing itself. The tension was thick enough to split. Jasmine didn't blink. At the core of this hearing was one explosive allegation, that Justice Gorsuch had quietly sold a Colorado property for nearly $500,000 to Brian Duffy, CEO of Greenberg Traurig, a law firm with over 20 cases argued before the court. The issue wasn't the sale, it was the secrecy. On his mandatory ethics disclosure, Gorsuch had simply left the buyer's name blank. A checked box, a blank line, 3 inches of silence. That omission brought him here, and Jasmine Crockett was about to ask the question that no one else had dared. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to stare him down. She came to lay down facts. And the first one hit like a controlled detonation. With a deliberate calm, Jasmine reached for a folder already tabbed and highlighted. Her fingers moved without hesitation, like someone handling evidence in a courtroom, not a hearing. Let's begin with the land, she said, her voice steady, her posture unshaken. She pulled out a full-color satellite map, unfolded it carefully, and held it up. Within seconds, staff projected the same image across the digital screens flanking the committee room. The aerial view showed rolling terrain in Granby, Colorado, quiet, unassuming, until her laser pointer struck the red dot on screen. This, she continued, is the parcel of land sold by Justice Neil Gorsuch shortly after his confirmation to the Supreme Court. She let the moment breathe. Then came Exhibit B, the official property deed. On screen, 2 names stood out in black ink. One, Neil M. Gorsuch, listed as the seller. The other, Brian Duffy, CEO of Greenberg, Traurig LLP, as the buyer. And here, Jasmine said, tapping the buyer line, we see the man who paid nearly $500,000 for this property, the head of a law firm that has stood before your bench, Justice Gorsuch, no fewer than 22 times since this transaction occurred. A hush fell over the room. Even the clicking of keyboards slowed. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her words carried more force than volume ever could. You sold this property just 9 days after taking your oath to serve on the highest court in the land. On your mandatory financial disclosure form, you noted the sale, but left the buyer unnamed. She turned back toward the committee. Not redacted, not protected, just left blank. She paused, then faced him fully. That's not a clerical error. That's a choice. She stepped aside and another screen lit up. A scrolling timeline. 22 cases, each with its own citation number, date of oral argument, and outcome. In 16 of them, Gorsuch ruled in favor of Greenberg's clients. This isn't a coincidence, Jasmine stated. It's a pattern that suggests more than oversight. It suggests entanglement. The chamber had never been quieter. Even the ambient hum of the cameras seemed to die. Jasmine advanced. So I'll ask the question the public's been screaming for years now. Why didn't you recuse yourself from any case involving Greenberg Traurig after accepting $500,000 from their CEO? Justice Gorsuch leaned slightly forward, his face unreadable, as if he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He smoothed the sleeve of his jacket, adjusted a cufflink with calculated care, and finally answered, flat, detached, and almost bored. I don't recall who the buyer was. The words fell like a trapdoor opening beneath the room. A ripple of disbelief swept across the audience. One aide dropped a pen. A reporter near the back of the chamber mouthed the words, "Are you serious?" Cameras caught the shift in posture, shoulders tensing, jaws clenching, glances exchanged in stunned silence. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She had seen this exact tactic before. Power wrapped in practiced amnesia, arrogance disguised as detachment. She wasn't surprised. She was ready. She stepped forward one final inch and leaned into the microphone. Not to perform, but to strike. Then allow me to reintroduce him to you, Justice Gorsuch, because Brian Duffy remembers. But silence was never the endgame. Jasmine hadn't come for denial. She came to reveal what power looks like when it thinks no one's watching. Slowly, deliberately, Jasmine reached into the final sleeve of her folder, the one she had marked with red tape the night before. Her fingers paused for half a second, not from hesitation, but from recognition. This was the moment everything pivoted. She drew out a single page and held it aloft, letting the thick paper catch the light. Across the top in bold letters, confidential, internal correspondence. She didn't speak at first. She let the silence stretch, holding the attention of every person in the room like a string pulled taut. Then with a nod, she passed the page to the clerk. Within seconds, it appeared on the twin projection screens behind her. A black and white email from Greenberg Traurig's internal server. A real-time freeze frame of something no one was ever supposed to see. It was dated just 5 days before the land sale close. The sender, Brian Duffy. The subject, Gorsuch deal, confirmed. And then in plain text, cold, clinical, unmistakable, Chot deal voy Justice Gorsuch, Huan Zhao Tunai Se Ko Loi Trong Vu Saptoi. No code, no euphemism, just the raw mechanics of a transactional justice system, written by the CEO of a firm that had cases pending before the very man he had just paid. The impact was immediate and electric. You could feel the pulse of the room change. Reporters sat up straighter. Staffers froze mid-note. One junior aide whispered something to his supervisor, but never got an answer. Even some of the more seasoned representatives exchanged glances that suggested finally that this hearing was no longer politics. It was something closer to betrayal. Jasmine took a breath, then stepped closer to the microphone. Her voice was calm but laced with a sharpened edge, each word landing like a gavel. "That's not speculation," she said. "That's intent. That's a law firm whose CEO bought property from a sitting justice, acknowledging, in writing, that the transaction was a strategic move for influence before this court." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The email had already screamed everything the public needed to hear. She turned slowly, letting her eyes settle on each member of the committee. "We have debated ethics. We have debated disclosure. But we are no longer debating intent." She let that hang in the air, her gaze steady, unshakable. This is not about the appearance of impropriety. This is impropriety, written, archived, time-stamped. It was then that Representative Langston, a Republican from North Carolina, with a long record of defending the judiciary, broke the silence. He leaned forward, pressed his mic button, and said tersely, "Mr. Chair, I move to suspend these proceedings immediately until counsel can review the validity of this so-called document." His tone wasn't measured. It was shaken, defensive, not out of confidence, but out of fear that this hearing had just crossed the line from uncomfortable to undeniable. Jasmine didn't turn to him. She didn't blink. She kept her eyes on Gorsuch, whose face remained stony, but his fingers were now drumming slightly against the table. "No," she said, not loudly, just clearly. Then she lifted her chin, and the words came like a blade. "No one leaves this room. Not today. Not when justice is being auctioned off in email chains and real estate closings. Her voice carried the weight of every American who had ever been told the system was too complicated to challenge. If influence can be bought for $500,000, then the rest of this country deserves to know the going price of its constitution. The room froze. No one spoke. The email still glowed on the screen behind her. And for the first time, the silence wasn't just procedural. It was the kind of silence that follows when people realize they've seen too much to ever pretend they didn't. But power, when cornered, doesn't concede. It lashes out. And what came next wasn't a defense. It was a contemptuous dagger aimed straight at her spine. Justice Gorsuch leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched just enough to register disdain without showing emotion. The room was still thick with the echo of Jasmine's words, her refusal to let the hearing be silenced, her unwavering demand that justice not be negotiated behind closed doors. But instead of engaging the evidence, Gorsuch chose another path. He shifted his gaze toward her, slowly, deliberately, as if deciding whether she was even worthy of acknowledgement. Then, with the cool, effortless cruelty that only comes from decades of insulation and unchecked authority, he spoke. "I don't take ethics lessons from someone like you." The words weren't shouted, but they hit the room like a dropped anvil. Not just dismissive, targeted. A phrase that carried centuries of coded condescension in 5 words. Someone like you, a woman, a black woman, a freshman congresswoman challenging a Supreme Court justice on live television. The subtext wasn't buried, it was broadcast. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded, like the stunned breath between the trigger pull and the gunshot. A few heads turned. Some committee members looked down, pretending to take notes. Others clenched their jaws, unsure if they should intervene or wait for the fallout. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't flinch, but the heat behind her eyes sharpened. Her hands tightened ever so slightly on the edge of the table. Not in weakness, but as if she were bracing for an earthquake that had already begun. What made it worse wasn't just the insult. It was how normal it sounded coming from a man in power. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was reminding her that this chamber, this system, this history, was built for him, not for her. And in that moment, the hearing stopped being about property sales or disclosure forms. It became something far older, far uglier, a trial of who gets to speak truth to power and who is expected to be silent. The insult didn't just hang in the air, it calcified centuries of exclusion into one smug sentence. But Jasmine didn't rise to his bait. She rose above it. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Instead, Jasmine Crockett leaned in just a fraction, letting the silence carry her power before she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was controlled, not cold, but sharpened. Every syllable sounded like it had been tempered by history, personal and collective. There was no tremor, no hesitation, just clarity. "People like me," she said, locking eyes with him, her tone steady and slow, "are exactly why you're sitting in that witness chair today." The room didn't move. Even the cameras stopped clicking, as if technology itself understood the weight of what had just been said. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was reclamation. 5 words of condescension had been answered with 15 words of unflinching truth. He had tried to make her presence small. She reminded him it was the very reason he had been summoned. But she wasn't done. She turned to her binder again, this time flipping to a printed congressional voting record. She slid a highlighted page from its sleeve and raised it so the chair could confirm it for the record. "Let the record reflect," she said evenly, "that Justice Gorsuch voted against a judicial ethics reform bill in 2020. A bill that would have required every member of the court to disclose financial transactions with any party appearing before them." She didn't rush the words. She wanted them to land, each one like a hammer on marble. Behind her, the screen lit up with the bill's title and summary. No spin, no interpretation, just the facts. Cold, unmovable, and devastating. "And now we see why," she continued. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened, anchored by something heavier than outrage. Conviction. "You didn't just oppose transparency, you actively protected your own silence." Her tone hardened. "And in doing so, you told the American people that Supreme Court ethics are optional, That disclosure is beneath you. That justice doesn't require daylight. She paused, not for effect, but because the truth needed room to breathe. She wasn't just calling out a vote. She was exposing a system that let one man shield himself behind black robes while rejecting the very light that justice demands. And in that moment, everyone watching understood. Gorsuch wasn't just on trial. The institution he served and the shield it gave him was too. But ethics forms weren't the beginning of this story. For Jasmine Crockett, the rot went deeper, far beyond real estate transactions and unchecked power. It began, like so many things in America, in a classroom. She closed the binder in front of her and reached for something that looked worn, less official, more personal. A manila folder, thin but carefully protected. She opened it, unfolded a typed letter, and paused. The silence in the hearing room was starting to feel less like a pause and more like a kind of judgment. An awareness that what came next wasn't just legal, it was human. "I'd like to enter into the record," she began, a letter written in 2012 by a third-year law student at the University of Colorado. She turned the page to the audience behind her. This student, a black woman, graduated in the top 5% of her class. She applied for a prestigious clerkship program and was told point blank that she wouldn't be considered because she didn't represent the ideals of intellectual neutrality. The words hung heavy. She was confused, Crockett continued. She pressed for clarity. What did that mean? She had the grades. The clerkship office even praised her writing. And then came the explanation that the professor overseeing the selection process did not believe in diversity-driven placements. That professor was Neil M. Gorsuch. A ripple of tension moved across the committee chamber. Just as Gorsuch shifted slightly in his seat, he didn't speak, but his hands tightened on the edge of the table. She wasn't rejected because she lacked the credentials. She was rejected because she was the credentials, just wrapped in the wrong skin, from the wrong zip code, carrying the wrong last name. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. It cut, slowly and precisely. And here's what matters. That woman never went on to clerk at any court. She ended up abandoning constitutional law entirely. Today, she teaches civics at a public high school in Denver. She tells her students that the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was built. There was no applause, no gasp, just stillness, because everyone in the room knew what had just been laid bare. Not a scandal, but a pattern. Jasmine stepped closer to the mic. Her eyes didn't leave Gorsuch's face. You see, this isn't new. Your disregard for accountability, your indifference to transparency, your belief that justice is reserved for the few, it didn't begin with your robe. It began long before. In the halls of academia, in rejection letters that no one ever questioned. It began with who you believed was qualified to enter your chambers. She gestured toward the gallery. And let's be honest, she's not the only one. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of stories just like hers. They don't make the news. They don't get televised hearings. But they're out there, breathing proof that judicial bias doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it's coded in a look, a shrug, a closed door. Then she paused. Not for drama, but because she needed to. My colleagues, she said, turning briefly to the other members of the committee, we've spent this morning asking whether Justice Gorsuch's financial silence was a breach of ethics. But how can we trust the ethics of a man who spent decades believing that diversity was a threat to excellence, not part of it? How can we trust judgment built on exclusion? The question didn't need an answer. It was already echoing in the minds of those watching. Outside, a low rumble began. It wasn't thunder. It was protest. The first chant started faint, just a few voices, but they grew louder by the second. Through the windows, security could be seen shifting positions. Phones buzzed quietly along the desk line as staff received updates from the Capitol perimeter. Hundreds had gathered, signs were up, flags waved, and the words could be made out clearly now. Not above the law. Recuse or resign. We remember the door you closed. Inside, Jasmine barely reacted. She had expected this, planned for it. Not the protest, but the truth breaking through. They're not here for drama, she said softly. They're here because they've seen this movie before. The one where the man in the highest office pretends his decisions are pure when they've been poisoned from the start. She reached for the microphone again and said, with finality, "You didn't just deny one student an opportunity. You denied generations of Americans the belief that their brilliance would be enough, that their talent alone could open the door." Justice Gorsuch still hadn't spoken, but for the first time all morning, his expression shifted. Not guilt, not fear, but something colder. Calculation. The room could feel it. This was no longer about rules. It was about what kind of power the country would tolerate and what kind it would finally reject. As the chants outside grew louder, the hearing took on the air of something far bigger than any bill or vote. This was legacy on trial. Not just his, but the court's, the country's, and Jasmine Crockett, standing with her hands on the desk, surrounded by records, silence, and the sound of truth outside the walls, was no longer just questioning a justice. She was interrogating the system that made him inevitable. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to just recount injustice. She came to rewrite the rules that allowed it to fester unchecked. She exhaled, not from fatigue, but from control, and reached beneath the desk for the leather folio she had carried with her since that morning. It had no seal, no gold trim, no flashy cover, just clean lines and quiet gravity. She placed it gently on the table, unclipped the flap, and opened it with the solemnity of someone unveiling not just policy, but memory. Inside was a single document, freshly printed, unsigned, but historic in intent. She held it with both hands as if the weight of the pages somehow mirrored the weight of what she was about to do. She looked to the chair of the committee and spoke clearly. "Mr. Chair, with your permission," she said, "I would like to formally submit the Judicial Accountability Act for immediate committee consideration." There was a pause, not long, but deep. One of those moments when even the hum of air conditioning seems to stop, and everyone senses that something irreversible is about to begin. Eyes lifted, aides leaned closer. Reporters instinctively raised their cameras as if expecting flashpoints before the fire. Crockett didn't wait. She slid the document forward into the spotlight, her voice firm but focused. "This legislation would require every sitting and future Supreme Court justice to disclose a full 10-year history of all financial holdings, transactions, and property transfers, including those involving any person or entity with business before the court." Her tone didn't waver. In a world of politics where statements are often softened for consensus, hers was delivered like an indictment. Not of one man, but of a system that had for too long confused elevation with exemption. She continued, eyes steady as they moved across the room. "It mandates annual updates, independent audits, and immediate recusal from any case involving prior financial relationships. No more voluntary compliance. No more selective transparency. No more hiding behind a robe while the people fund your silence." It was a cascade of language sharpened by lived experience. Not theoretical, not distant. This was a woman who had seen injustice up close and was now setting conditions under which it would no longer thrive quietly in legal gray zones. Each clause was a response to every evasion she had just spent hours exposing. She paused, but not to grandstand. This was her style. Deliver the blow, and then let the truth settle into the bone. The room was silent now, except for the faint clicking of laptops catching up to the magnitude of what had just been said. Then, as if to seal the intent behind her words, she added, "This act doesn't target one man," she said, her gaze sliding briefly, but unmistakably, to Justice Gorsuch. "It restores a principle that no one, not even a justice of the Supreme Court, is above accountability." That sentence didn't just land. It rearranged the energy in the room. The judicial branch had long lived behind velvet ropes, high on its marble pedestal. But now Crockett had aimed legislation straight at its spine, and done so in daylight, in front of cameras, with her name on every word. And the setting mattered. She hadn't introduced this quietly in a closed-door rules committee. She hadn't sent it to a staffer in an email to float among party strategists. No, she had launched it in the heat of a live national hearing, while the very embodiment of judicial opacity sat just a few feet away. This was not politics. This was clarity. But power rarely yields to truth without a fight. And in that chamber, resistance came not in silence, but in fire. The veneer of detachment shattered. Until that moment, Justice Gorsuch had sat like a man cloaked in marble, unshaken, unbothered, untouchable. But now the pressure cracked the surface. He leaned forward, not out of formality but fury, his voice no longer cool but sharpened with disdain. His words came fast, each one flung like a gauntlet across the table. "This is not reform," he spat, his tone clipped and rising. "This is a politically motivated stunt, a retaliation disguised as accountability." It wasn't just a denial, it was an indictment of the hearing, of the process, of Jasmine Crockett herself. This is not about ethics. It's about targeting judicial independence. It's political retribution dressed up as transparency. The room tensed, not from the volume, but from the desperation behind it. For hours, Gorsuch had hidden behind carefully composed silence, a portrait of indifference. But now that silence had curdled into defiance. Not principled resistance, but panic dressed in righteous robes. His sudden outburst wasn't the stance of an innocent man. It was the reflex of someone who felt the floor beginning to give way beneath his feet. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She simply sat still, eyes fixed on him. Not in confrontation, but in confirmation, as if the moment had said more than his words ever could. And then, almost as if summoned by the heat in the room, a quiet shift occurred. A congressional staffer moved toward the chair with a sealed envelope. Plain, no markings except one. Confidential. The chair accepted it wordlessly, sliced it open with a letter opener, and read. His brow tightened. Then his eyes moved to the committee's general counsel, who leaned in quickly, reading over his shoulder. A decision was made in a breath. Without warning, the chair tapped his microphone. "Staff will project the document received for immediate committee review." The screen behind the witness table flickered. Text appeared. At the top, confidential whistleblower declaration, verified. And then the opening line, stark and precise. In March 2017, Justice Gorsuch knowingly delayed issuing a ruling in Case 17-1263 to ensure his personal real estate transaction could close without press scrutiny. The oxygen seemed to drain from the room. It wasn't just shocking, it was surgical. The document went on. The anonymous source identified themselves only as a former staff attorney for the Supreme Court, someone with direct access to the internal case calendar and decision workflows. The ruling, originally drafted and ready for publication by February 28th, was postponed until after April 4th. The Colorado cell closed on April 1st. In 2 sentences, the entire framework of defense Gorsuch had built collapsed into dust. This wasn't about disclosure anymore. This was about deliberate delay, strategic silence, an abuse of the timing mechanism of the highest court in the nation for personal protection. Several members of the committee visibly shifted in their seats, not out of partisanship, but disbelief. One aide covered her mouth with a trembling hand. A journalist in the gallery fumbled to refocus their lens, as if realizing in real time that the story had just changed shape. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't move. Her stillness was a power all its own. The weight of this moment didn't need commentary. It needed witness. Gorsuch tried to speak, but his mouth hung half open, no words formed. His fingers tapped once on the table, then stopped, as if realizing even the sound betrayed him now. The chair cleared his throat. "The witness will remain silent," he said. His tone, measured until now, was unmistakably steel. "This chamber is now in possession of whistleblower testimony directly implicating potential judicial misconduct. Further responses must be submitted in writing." In that instant, the dynamics flipped completely. Gorsuch was no longer a participant in the hearing. He was a subject of active investigation, and the room, once tilted in reverence toward his title, was now bracing itself to absorb the truth beneath his robe. Outside, the chants had grown louder, but inside, the silence felt heavier than sound. A line had been crossed, not by a bill, not by a voice, but by a fact, a buried fact that had clawed its way to the surface. And now there was no going back. The screen dimmed, but the damage was done. Gorsuch's silence had spoken louder than any denial, and the room was already shifting from revelation to reckoning. The chair's gavel struck once, sharply, decisively. The sudden echo startled even the aides lining the back wall. "This committee will now move into emergency session," he declared. His voice, once procedural, now carried the weight of an irreversible decision. "Pursuant to House rules and the urgency of the evidence presented, we will vote on the immediate referral of this matter to the Department of Justice for formal investigation." Gasps didn't ripple. They cracked. Even for Washington, this was rare. This wasn't censure. This wasn't symbolic. This was a direct pipeline from legislative scrutiny to criminal accountability. The kind of vote usually whispered about behind closed doors, now playing out live on national television. Jasmine Crockett remained still as the committee clerk distributed one-page ballots, simple, stark, labeled Referral Motion, DOJ, Justice N. Gorsuch. No fanfare, no speeches, just names, pens, and silence. The members wrote quickly, some with trembling hands, others with tight jaws and steady resolve. This wasn't just about Gorsuch anymore. It was about the precedent. If the court could no longer police its own, Congress had to. And in that truth lay a dangerous, necessary power shift. From the corner of the hearing room, a C-SPAN producer counted down in hushed tones. Cable news had gone to split screens, half the country watching the vote, the other half watching legal analysts scramble to rewrite what tomorrow's headlines would mean. The entire nation, it seemed, was suspended in that long, slow breath between action and fallout. Then came the count. The clerk stepped to the microphone, voice careful, clear. On the motion to refer the testimony, exhibits, and all related materials regarding Justice Neil M. Gorsuch to the Department of Justice, she paused, glancing toward the chair, who gave a slight nod. The vote is recorded as 11 in favor, 2 opposed. The motion passes. For a heartbeat, there was no reaction, just quiet disbelief, the kind that only follows institutional rupture, when a chamber built to preserve power decides at last to challenge it. Then came the sound, not from the committee but from beyond the walls, outside the Capitol where thousands had gathered. A wave of cheers, chants, shouts. The walls didn't shake, but the atmosphere did. It was as if history had cracked open just wide enough to let truth fall through. And the people felt it. Not justice yet, but the possibility of it. And that alone was enough to turn sidewalks into epicenters. Inside, reporters were already shouting questions across the aisle. "Congresswoman Crockett, will you demand recusals in pending cases? Do you believe this is grounds for impeachment? What does this mean for the legitimacy of the court?" But Jasmine didn't respond. She stood slowly, collected her papers, and placed them neatly back into the leather folio that had started it all. She didn't grandstand. She didn't wave. She walked quietly, deliberately, through the doors and into the hall, where America was waiting. By the time she reached the marble rotunda, the news cycle had detonated. CNN's lower third blazed, "Breaking. Gorsuch referred to DOJ for criminal investigation. MSNBC cut live to a constitutional law professor. Fox News switched to DEFCON 1, calling it a partisan coup. Twitter surge. Judicial crisis, Josh Crockett doctrine, and Kosh Supreme for sale trended globally within the hour. And deep inside a private conference room at Greenberg-Traurig headquarters, the legal team had already been summoned, because the next blow was swift and brutal. At 4:11 p.m. Eastern, Bloomberg broke the story. Markets react to Gorsuch scandal. Greenberg-Traurig stock plummets 17% in first hour of after-hours trading. By 7:30 p.m., they had lost over $900 million in market valuation. Institutional investors began dumping shares, citing integrity risk. Internal emails leaked, top clients expressing concern about future litigation exposure. One message titled "Urgent PR Directive" read, "We cannot be linked to unethical influence over the Supreme Court. Mitigation strategy required. Terminate any current DC advisory contracts. Full audit of executive communications requested by morning." By dawn, legal columnists were comparing it to Arthur Anderson post-Enron, not because of criminal charges, those hadn't come yet, but because the illusion of proximity had become liability. A firm that had once bragged about access now found itself radioactive. Back on Capitol Hill, the House Judiciary Committee issued its public statement just before midnight. It was only 2 paragraphs long, but every word was chosen with surgical intent. The committee has voted in accordance with its constitutional duty to refer credible allegations of judicial misconduct to the Department of Justice. The integrity of the American legal system requires transparency and accountability at all levels, even the highest. The American people deserve nothing less. And beneath that statement, one name stood out in bold. Submitted by Representative Jasmine Crockett, TX30. It was the final punctuation mark on a day that would be taught in law schools for decades. A day when Congress stopped treating the Supreme Court like a shrine and started treating it like what it was supposed to be, a public institution answerable to the people. For Jasmine Crockett, though, it wasn't celebration. It was confirmation. She hadn't come to tear something down. She had come to expose what was already rotting beneath the robes. And now that it was out in the open, the real work, the dangerous work, was just beginning. Because referring evidence was only the first step. The question now was whether justice, real, untouchable, unbought, had the courage to walk through the door she had just kicked open. But once a wall cracks in public view, it doesn't take long for the pressure from inside to finish what the outside began. The blow from Congress was loud, but what followed inside the hushed marble corridors of the Supreme Court was something far more devastating. It came in silence, in glances, in doorways left slightly ajar. It came not from protesters or journalists, but from within the bench itself, from justices who had once spoken of collegiality, now forced to confront a colleague whose silence had become a stain. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was the first to speak, not in the press, but in chambers. According to a leaked memo later confirmed by 2 court clerks, she requested a closed-door ethics review, an unprecedented internal inquiry into Justice Gorsuch's financial disclosures and case history. The language was careful, legalistic, but there was no mistaking the intent. The court cannot shield itself from scrutiny when trust is eroded from within, the memo read. If we do not act, the institution will fracture under the weight of our silence. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson followed days later, not with a memo but with action. She refused to join Gorsuch's majority opinion draft in a key upcoming business ethics case, citing unresolved questions of integrity that could compromise the court's credibility. For a sitting justice to call out another, in writing, in internal circulation, was unheard of. The leak of that statement to the Washington Post was not accidental. It was a signal. A fracture had formed in the high court's illusion of invulnerability, and now the world could see it. By that Thursday, Chief Justice John Roberts had summoned an emergency administrative meeting, again off the record, and again not unanimous. The topic was clear: public confidence, institutional optics, and Gorsuch's continued participation in upcoming cases involving Greenberg-Traurig. Pressure was mounting fast. Clerks were being pulled from assignments. Internal legal teams were being looped into conflict reviews normally reserved for the lowest federal circuits. Then came the inevitable. 3 upcoming cases, Greenberg-Traurig vs. FEC, Trivanti Systems v. United States, and Bernstein et al. v. Securities and Exchange Commission, all had one thing in common: direct or indirect involvement by the law firm whose CEO had bought Gorsuch's land. And now, with the DOJ referral active and whistleblower allegations still under review, Gorsuch had no choice but to recuse. The recusal memo, dated and filed quietly, was just 4 lines long. But those 4 lines cracked open a new chapter. To preserve the integrity of this court and ensure impartiality in all proceedings, I recuse myself from deliberation and judgment in the above-captioned cases due to conflict of interest concerns presently under inquiry. No apology, no admission, just retreat. The move sent shockwaves through the federal judiciary. Legal blogs lit up with speculation. Scholars questioned whether prior rulings needed to be re-examined. Activists called for more recusals. Some began pushing a broader audit of all financial relationships involving justices over the last 2 decades. The court was no longer an island. It had become a battlefield. And the public? The public moved fast. What started as a late-night tweet from a political ethics nonprofit ballooned within hours into a nationwide campaign. The hashtag was simple: #resign Gorsuch. The website launched by 10 a.m. the next day. It featured just one line beneath the justice's photo: "No one who manipulates the law for personal gain deserves to interpret it for the rest of us." Within 24 hours, the petition had broken 800,000 signatures. By the second day, it had passed 2 million, faster than any judicial petition in U.S. history. Celebrities reposted it, law professors endorsed it, veterans groups, teacher unions, and even former judicial nominees added their names. A dozen state bar associations released public statements supporting further investigation. Cable networks ran hourly updates on the signature count, treating it like an election night. But what struck hardest wasn't the petition itself. It was how united the anger felt across political lines. This wasn't partisan. This wasn't progressive outrage. This was institutional betrayal, and it hit something primal. Even those who had once defended conservative jurisprudence now found themselves asking one question: if a justice alters the calendar of justice for personal gain, what else will they bend? Inside the court, the atmosphere had changed entirely. Conversations no longer lingered. Lunchrooms emptied quicker. Drafts from Gorsuch's office came later and thinner, reviewed more heavily by staff who were now instructed to maintain chain of custody standards on internal documents, a quiet admission that trust had eroded not only externally, but between chambers. One junior clerk, speaking anonymously to The Atlantic, said, "It used to feel like working in the clouds, above the mess. Now it feels like standing inside the storm." And Justice Gorsuch? He said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no press releases. But his walk changed, shoulders stiffer, eyes cast downward, steps a little quicker through the hall between chambers and courtroom. The confidence that once carried him like a fixed star through controversy had dulled. The robe still carried weight, but now that weight pressed inward. And Jasmine Crockett? She remained where she had always been, in motion. In interviews, she refused to gloat. "This isn't about taking someone down," she told PBS NewsHour. "It's about lifting up the standard. We can't ask the American people to believe in justice if we don't hold ourselves to the same rules they live under." Her words landed harder because she had never raised her voice. She hadn't stormed out of hearings. She hadn't attacked. She had built a case, with facts, with courage, with relentless calm. And now that case had moved the needle of a nation. Back inside the Capitol, the Judiciary Committee quietly updated its referral file with every new revelation: recusal memos, internal leaks, statements from fellow justices. It was no longer just evidence. It was an accumulating storm file, growing heavier by the day. The DOJ had not yet commented, but the writing was on the wall. And across the country, from classrooms to courtrooms, one phrase echoed louder than the rest: if even the highest court can fall to secrecy, then transparency isn't an option. It's survival. The Supreme Court had never faced a reckoning like this, and it had only just begun. While the marble halls of the court sat in silence, a very different kind of voice was rising, clear, defiant, and impossible to ignore. The ballroom of the Washington Renaissance Hotel was packed wall to wall. Over 3,000 law students, junior attorneys, public defenders, and newly minted JDs had flown in from across the country for the National Young Lawyers Conference. But this year, no one was there for the workshops or the networking brunch. Every chair, every staircase, every square foot of standing space was taken by people who wanted one thing: to hear Jasmine Crockett speak. The lights dimmed. The crowd fell into a hush that felt more like a held breath than polite anticipation. There were no gimmicks, no video montage, just a lone podium, a single spotlight, and a woman walking toward it with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who had already changed the rules and now came to redefine what they meant. Jasmine Crockett stood at the microphone, letting the silence work for her. No teleprompter, just a few handwritten note cards she barely glanced at. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, the kind of quiet that commands a room without ever asking. "I was taught," she began, "that law is a shield and a sword, that it protects the innocent, but also cuts through the lies power tells itself to survive." She paused. But too often the sword is kept sharp while the shield is left to rust. We defend institutions. We forget to defend the people they were built for. There were no interruptions, no coughs, no shifting in seats. Just thousands of future lawyers, judges, and scholars locked in. Because this wasn't a speech. It was a call to memory and a call to arms. "You've watched what's unfolded," she said, her tone tightening just enough to signal that this part was personal. "You've seen what happens when those who interpret the law believe they are above it, when they think transparency is a threat, when they believe silence is the same as integrity." Her voice rose, not loud but heavy. "But here's the truth. Justice is not a lifetime title. It is a lifetime responsibility." The room didn't erupt. It exhaled, like a collective release of breath from a generation raised to believe they had to wait their turn. They had just been handed a sentence that didn't just critique the system, it redefined its moral contract. Justice is not a lifetime title. It is a lifetime responsibility. Cameras clicked. Phones rose. Journalists scrambled to type the quote before it exploded. And exploded it did. By the time she walked off stage, no music, no confetti, just applause that refused to end. The phrase had already reached social media. Within 10 minutes, it was trending globally. Clips from the speech went viral across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. Edited versions, some overlaid with slow-motion black and white filters and piano chords, hit over 1 million views by sunset. Law students began carving the quote into their phone cases. Professors printed it on their syllabi. One mural artist in Philadelphia painted it across a brick wall in blue and gold, with Crockett's silhouette beside it, chin raised. And then came the headline that caught fire. "The next RBG, Jasmine Crockett's historic speech redefines the modern court." It wasn't a stretch. Young women, especially black and brown women in law schools, began calling her the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of our era. Not because she had the same legal path, but because she had a voice that could cut through marble. One that carried both memory and vision. One that didn't ask for justice. It demanded it with receipts, with fire, and with composure. By midnight, a new hashtag had emerged, started by a third-year law student from UCLA, #Crockett Doctrine. It was meant as a joke, a half-sarcastic take on legal theories gone viral, but it caught like dry grass in August. The hashtag became a rallying cry. Tweets flooded in. "The Crockett Doctrine, speak truth to the highest power, even when it's dressed in robes." The Crockett Doctrine, ethics aren't optional, they're oxygen. The Crockett Doctrine, if the people can't question the court, then it's not justice, it's monarchy. Memes followed, so did opinion columns. And within 24 hours, CNN invited Crockett to deliver a televised address on Anderson Cooper 360. Not a panel, a speech, alone, on prime time. But behind the spotlight and the viral fame, Jasmine Crockett remained painfully aware of what had made this moment possible. Injustice. Raw. Repetitive. Systemic. She hadn't risen by outshouting others. She had risen by showing what it looks like to outlast a system that expects you to fold under the weight of your own decency. In private, she told her team, "They're calling it the Crockett Doctrine, but it's not mine. It belongs to every black woman who's been interrupted in court. Every public defender who's watched clients get sentenced while white-collar crooks walk free. Every student told they weren't neutral enough for a clerkship. Because Crockett knew something the headlines hadn't yet grasped. This wasn't a moment, it was a warning. If justice is to survive, it must evolve. If truth is to matter, it must interrupt. And if institutions refuse to clean their own house, then those who were never invited in will have to do it for them. That was the doctrine, and it was just getting started. While the internet crowned a doctrine, the wheels of justice began turning, not with spectacle, but with the cold precision of something unstoppable. At 6:02 a.m. Eastern, before sunrise kissed the Capitol dome, the first federal subpoenas were quietly dispatched. No sirens, no press releases. Just sealed envelopes and encrypted communications, leaving the Justice Department's public integrity section under strict chain of custody protocols. Their destination: 3 financial institutions in Colorado, 1 private law firm in D.C., and the Administrative Records Department of the Supreme Court of the United States. The criminal investigation into Justice Neil Gorsuch had officially begun. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper, a deliberate silence that meant only one thing in Washington. Things were real now. By 9 a.m., when the DOJ confirmed the probe with a carefully worded press briefing, "We are conducting a full criminal investigation into allegations of financial non-disclosure and judicial interference by a sitting Supreme Court justice." The floodgates opened. Cameras swarmed the DOJ steps. Microphones were thrust into the faces of analysts, clerks, and constitutional scholars, as if any one of them might have the quote that could hold history in a sentence. News outlets cleared schedules. Social media surged. But inside the department, the mood was grave, mechanical, relentless. This was not politics anymore. This was law. Attorney General Melissa Granger, a former federal prosecutor known for dismantling corporate corruption rings, took the lead herself. No delegation, no stand-ins. Her statement, delivered from the DOJ's 7th floor with a voice that cracked 0 times, was clear. The Department of Justice will pursue this matter with the same commitment to integrity we expect from the court itself. No one is above the Constitution. Those 14 words ricocheted through the nation. No one is above the Constitution. They weren't new, but they had never been aimed so high. Within hours, federal agents with judicial authority filed formal requests for Gorsuch's real estate transaction records, internal Supreme Court scheduling calendars, and all email correspondence between Gorsuch and Greenberg-Traurig personnel in the 6-month window surrounding the 2017 property sale. The requests weren't narrow. They were sprawling, like a net designed to catch not just one moment, but the culture that allowed it. Behind closed doors, current and former clerks received subpoenas. Some cried, others lawyered up. A few, according to DOJ officials, broke down mid-interview, not from guilt, but from the crushing knowledge that the system they had once revered now hung by the thread of their testimony. One of them, a former scheduling aide, provided a document that would become central to the case, a private email chain in which Gorsuch requested that a ruling draft be held through Q2 due to pending personal matters. The draft, the same ruling in Case 17-1263, the one delayed until after the Colorado land deal had closed. The timeline was no longer theory. It was now a digital trail, admissible and time-stamped, one that formed the backbone of a criminal case that could forever change the boundaries of judicial immunity. Meanwhile, on the steps of the court, silence loomed like scaffolding. Gorsuch issued no statement. His legal team, however, filed an early motion accusing the DOJ of executive branch overreach against the independence of the judiciary. But no one in the public bought it, not after the whistleblower, not after the recusal memos, not after the vote, not after the image of Jasmine Crockett, still resonant in memory, reminding the world that responsibility and robe were not the same thing. By the second day of the investigation, the tone in Washington had shifted. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. This was a constitutional confrontation. Law professors from Yale to Berkeley began publishing emergency symposiums online. Editorials clashed. Is this the end of judicial impunity? The fall of the robe? Jasmine Crockett and the age of accountability? And yet, in the middle of the noise, the injustice that had sparked it all still lingered. Because through it all, through the hearings, the recusal, the social explosion, the DOJ probe, Jasmine Crockett had received death threats. Hundreds. Her security detail was tripled. Her office had to be swept twice a day. She hadn't seen her family in weeks. Some of her own colleagues stopped making eye contact in the hallway, afraid of what it might cost to stand too close to fire. That was the price of truth. That was the toll of being first. And yet she kept showing up. When asked by a journalist outside the Capitol how she felt about the DOJ action, she answered without fanfare, "This isn't about revenge, it's about repair." But inside, the cost was real, because what happens when you shine a light into the highest room of power is that you don't just expose the corruption, you expose who allowed it to grow. And not everyone is ready to face the mirror. Back at the DOJ, forensic accountants had begun dissecting a decade of Gorsuch's financial disclosures. They cross-referenced asset movement with case assignments, And though no one said it out loud yet, some investigators were beginning to whisper the one word no one had dared to apply to the Supreme Court: conspiracy. Outside, rallies formed in real time, not against Gorsuch, against the idea that this could happen at all, that a lifetime appointee could sell silence, delay rulings, and expect no one to ask why. The justice system was not on trial. The myth of its untouchability was. And it was unraveling, one subpoena, one headline, one truth at a time. As subpoenas flew and institutions recalibrated, a quieter storm was brewing, one Jasmine Crockett never asked for, and one she had no intention of writing. The whispers started as a ripple, then swelled into headlines. Crockett for president? Great draft Jasmine 2028. Gains steam. Across town halls and college campuses, the question turned from admiration into momentum. Political action committees began forming without her consent. Pundits on all sides, liberal, moderate, even conservative reformers, floated the idea that the woman who held the robe to the fire could now hold the country's highest office. Petitions were launched. Merch appeared overnight. A New York Times front-page poll showed 38% of likely voters would support her in a general election, unprecedented for someone who hadn't even declared. And yet the answer was already decided. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't hire a speechwriter. She didn't test the waters with vague language or exploratory committees. She did what only Jasmine Crockett would do. She went on record, live, alone, and unfiltered. PBS's Frontline had requested a closing interview, something reflective. Jasmine agreed, but only under one condition: no edits, no soft lighting, just the truth. The set was stark: an undecorated chair, a plain backdrop, no flag, no staged bookshelf. She wore navy, no jewelry. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger, but not untouched. The interviewer asked the question softly, almost cautiously, as if anticipating a pivot. With millions calling for you to run, will you consider a presidential campaign in the upcoming cycle? Jasmine leaned forward, not aggressively, but with clarity. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise. It simply cut through the moment like a scalpel. "I don't need to own the White House," she said. "I just need to keep clean the place where justice is spoken." There was no applause track, no dramatic music, just silence, and the sound of every viewer suddenly understanding what conviction looked like when it wasn't trying to sell itself. That moment broke the internet, not because it was showy, but because it was real. In a world of branding and ambition, someone had finally said, enough. That their power was rooted not in wanting more, but in protecting what still mattered. That not every victory ends with a crown. Some end with the quiet satisfaction of knowing you didn't let the system corrupt your name. The quote, her quote, became a tattoo, a poster, a pledge in law classrooms. "I don't need to own the White House. I just need to keep clean the place where justice is spoken." Within 12 hours, it was inscribed in Latin and carved onto the wall of a grassroots legal defense center in Detroit. Professors taught it next to Brandeis, Marshall, and Ginsburg. Civil rights groups adopted it into mission statements. And across social media, the hashtag changed from chummer Crockett for president to something bolder, more enduring: Crockett line. Because this wasn't just a rejection of power, it was a redefinition of it. Jasmine Crockett became a symbol not because she sought the spotlight, but because she was willing to burn beneath it so others could see more clearly. She had walked into a courtroom stacked against her, faced down one of the most protected men in America, held firm under pressure, and never once blinked. She didn't climb the ladder to tear others down. She exposed the rot holding the ladder up, and still chose to leave it standing for those who would one day ascend. Her story didn't end in a motorcade or a campaign ad. It ended the way all truth should, with the system forced to look at itself in the mirror she held up. And yet somehow that wasn't the end. In every corner of the country, her name remained, spoken not in chants but in courtrooms, in classrooms, in whispered moments between young girls who had once thought justice was someone else's job. She had shown them that power wasn't just about who sat on the throne. It was about who refused to be crowned when their people needed a shield instead. The marble steps of the court grew quieter, the chamber forever altered. The robe, once used as armor, was now, for the first time in generations, subject to review. Reform bills passed. Disclosures were updated. Confidence, while bruised, began to stitch itself back together. But it did so only because one woman had refused to lie still beneath the weight of tradition. And though the cameras moved on and the headlines faded, the echo remained. In libraries, in petitions, in one simple sentence written on the walls of history, not by power, but by principle. I just need to keep clean the place where justice is spoken. And when the cameras dimmed, when the crowd dispersed and the applause gave way to silence, what lingered wasn't her words. It was the question she left behind. What does it truly cost to stand for justice when everyone around you is trained to look away? That was the lesson buried beneath every hearing room, every whisper campaign, every threat that Jasmine Crockett faced along her ascent. We like to believe that truth is enough, that facts will speak for themselves, that the law will correct itself when it begins to rot. But the truth is this: systems don't collapse under the weight of corruption. They collapse under the weight of the silence built to protect it. Jasmine didn't break the system. She forced it to hear itself scream. And in doing so, she showed the world the difference between holding power and holding a principle. She walked into a chamber where she was expected to be ornamental, a flash of formality, a symbolic face in a sea of polished suits. But she refused to play a role. She chose confrontation over comfort. She chose to be uninvited rather than unspoken. And the world watched as her courage peeled back layer after layer of institutional arrogance, revealing something far uglier beneath. A legacy built not on justice, but on selective privilege, wrapped in robes and reinforced with tradition. The human cost of her resistance cannot be sanitized. She was mocked, threatened, isolated. Even those who privately cheered her bravery stayed publicly neutral. Some of the very institutions she fought to restore treated her as an outsider, too direct, too uncompromising, too unwilling to speak in code. But that, perhaps, was her greatest weapon. She refused to be fluent in the language of careful betrayal. She spoke truth the way it needed to be spoken, loud, specific, and without apology. And in doing so, she reminded an entire nation of something we're taught to forget: that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the persistent. It belongs to those who show up when the odds are impossible. It belongs to those who stay standing when others sit in silence. It belongs to the ones who carry their principles not like armor, but like open wounds, and still keep walking. There's a reason her words went viral, not because they were catchy, but because they were carved from experience, because they carried pain and clarity in equal measure, because every person who had ever been denied a seat at the table, every woman who had ever been spoken over, every voice that had ever been softened to survive, they heard something in her that they recognized: the sound of truth refusing to wait for permission. And yet, perhaps the most profound lesson wasn't about Jasmine at all. It was about us, about a country that watched a single woman demand accountability from the very structure designed to be untouchable, and then had to ask itself, why did it take so long? Why was she the first? Why did the marble crack only after it was met with a voice that had been told for generations to stay quiet? The answer, as always, is uncomfortable. Because we build our systems to look strong, but we rarely ask if they are fair. We celebrate tradition even when that tradition silences dissent. We confuse status with wisdom. We confuse robes with righteousness. And when someone dares to expose the difference, we call it radical. We call it divisive. We call it too much. But that's the lie, because justice is never too much. It's simply too rare. So here's the human lesson carved from every page of this story. Justice isn't an institution. It's a choice, a daily one, a dangerous one, a lonely one. It doesn't begin in marble chambers or courtroom gavels. It begins in whispers, in resistance, in a woman standing alone with a folder full of facts and a voice full of fire. And in the end, justice isn't what saved her. She saved it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.